Video 7. The weaponry of the traditional drug suppliers weakens illegalization's ability to cause higher prices and thus less use and users. If our drug policies really did become successful in preventing production of drugs and increasing seizures and destruction, and if globalization failed to keep prices down, and if self-supply didn't increase, even then higher prices would not necessarily follow, because not only drugs users but also its suppliers have a few aces of their own. Cocaine might presently, 2016, be in rather short supply. Amphetamine-type substances, or ATS, and cannabis is increasingly produced locally and thus ever less affected by law enforcement's efforts. Opium, however, tells a much more interesting story, and it's arguably the case that today's stockpiles could offset a 10% increase in heroin seizures for more than half a century. To understand how bothered the main heroin suppliers are by the prospect of increased law enforcement seizures, consider this. 1. As the Afghan Taliban in the year 2000 for the third time proclaimed a religiously motivated ban on poppy growing, reducing national output with maybe 90% and thus world output with maybe 75, worldwide seizures were down only 40%, and consumer prices were not significantly affected. 2. Consider this. Today cannabis is transported all the way from Afghanistan to Western Europe, and the fear of what law enforcement might get up to is thus such that the racket figures it makes economic sense to transport bulky cannabis all this way. The racket sometimes will not even bother to ship the, at least normally, more potent, more expensive and less bulky hashish that the markets of Western Europe traditionally prefer, instead sending marijuana. So, if the racket figures that it makes sense to 1. Ban poppy growing, and 2. Transport bulky marijuana all the way from Afghanistan to Europe, would it not be easy for them to counter increased law enforcement efforts by 1. Not banning poppy growing, and 2. Transport less bulky drugs such as heroin, or at least hashish instead of marijuana? There are other aces up the traditional supplier's sleeves: unexplored growing areas, product redistribution from low to high profit markets, locals ready to wage a war on their behalf, and profit margins sometimes so great that suppliers can act monopolist-like and not be bothered about where supply and demand meet. Actually, most intelligent drug lords probably worry more about increased self-supply than about law enforcement efforts. Next, it will be argued that whereas the attempt to reduce the supply of drugs works mainly through the creation of higher prices, the attempt to reduce demand for drugs as a side effect creates lower prices, resulting in policy incompatibility, something that, in turn and again, reduces illegalization's power to cause higher prices and thus less use.